Thank you, Mike, to you and your team for the kind invitation. It's a real honor to be here. I've only been at one other U.S. Civil War roundtable, and that was in Harrisburg, in Pennsylvania, with the great Dick Summers, who's a mentor of mine. Thank you, Eric Bush, my colleague from the SHAPE headquarters in Mons. We work together, member here. As Mike said, I was very fortunate as a military officer to be allowed to go into civilian universities and get a degree at a time in the early 2000s when that was considered to be important for the first time ever. And I started a PhD in 2003, was given 9 months of full-time and then 7 years part-time to finish, including multiple deployments and family time taken away. But I'm a stupid infantryman and I don't quit. So like I said, I'm going to do this. 2011 graduated with a topic that's not Canadian and not British Imperial history, the Civil War. Why? Because I spent years with the U.S. Army in the U.S. in various assignments, and I convinced my Queen's University commission looking after me that I needed to study in their archives. And where I lived in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, there were 20 million documents on the U.S. Army. So over the course of over 2 years, I culled those. And as you do with a PhD, you always get enough material for 4 PhD theses, and then narrowed that in 2 years to a proper dissertation for defense. And then under the great Peter Maslowski and Roger Spiller turned that into a book. And unfortunately have not been able to get back to the Civil War since 2014 because of deployments and my current job, which is as the senior historian in NATO at the Supreme Headquarters in Mons, an advisor to SACIR. So I'm actually much more immersed every day in things that are the current area in the past 70 years NATO than I am in the Civil War. Nonetheless, my passion is still there. It's been a passion since I was a young child. Spent many a day in my years in the States, many a day on the battlefields, and many a day in the archives. So I'm really happy to present this. What is it? It's a relationship. It's a good talk about the relationship between 3 critical things that are really actually still controversial amongst American historians and some other historians. The role of West Point, the role of the doctrine of military science in the conduct of the Civil War, and how they relate. And I'll get a little more about that explanation after I do why is this controversial. And for that, I need to go back to before the Civil War. Back to the Revolution, the War of Independence. George Washington became General of the Army in 1775, and he arrived at the first major battle, which was the Siege of Boston. And he found that the American Army, as it was constituted then, mainly of militia, mobilized, were brave. They were good with their firearms, and some of them knew how to fire a cannon, but had no technical expertise. No engineers, no artillerists who could move multiple guns in battery formations, and know how to conduct a siege. He immediately engaged Continental Congress, who actually very shortly after sent envoys over to France. And of course, at that time, the French were at the pinnacle of military engineering and civil engineering in the world. And the King of France agreed to send 4 of his royal engineers to help the Americans. The Americans also managed to get 4 or 5 other engineers, mainly French, but Poles as well, to come and assist them. And they began to educate the American Army in engineering and artillery, as well as the great von Steuben came over, Prussian, to look at infantry cavalry tactics. They then constituted 3 companies of engineers in the Continental Army, very well trained by the French. They then, before 1780, began an engineering school with an artillery association attached to it at a place called West Point, and that's in the top right-hand corner. 1780 that started, but within a year, the difference in the Continental Army was evident. It was really evident at the Siege of Yorktown in 1781, where French and American forces demonstrated very competent craft in siege work and artillery fire. And this made a big contrast to where they were in 1775. When the war ended in 1783, unfortunately for those who were pro-US military establishment, they were facing amongst all of the states a tradition of radical Whiggism that would not allow permanent forces. And they started to whittle down the army to next to nothing. Eventually, they agreed to have a couple of infantry regiments on the frontier to assist the settlers and the Indians in their relations. And they agreed to have some sea fortifications, but not beyond that. Washington attempted after the war to convince the government to have schools and to teach officers who were infantry and cavalry to teach them artillery and engineering skills. That didn't fly. French officers who had served with the Continental Army, the engineers under Colonel Duperteux, stayed on in America for a while with L'Enfant, who eventually builds Washington, the city of Washington. And they put together ideas they give to the government on creating military frontiers along the coast with hard fortifications, just like in France, just like in England, to prevent invasion. And that's dismissed as a non-starter by the Continental Congress, or the Senate at the time. It's only in the 1790s, when there's a threat of European invasion on the coasts again, that the American government starts to look at a permanent engineering artillery organization and a professional army much more of greater size than two small regiments. But nothing really happens until Jefferson gets in place. In 1802, he forms the United States Military Academy at West Point, which then takes on instruction of officers. Starts in 1802, but it's actually an ad hoc organization for the first 18 years. Students can come and go as they please. They're picked by superior officers, not by the nation, not by the command structure of the military. They only stay for 6 months or a year maximum, and it's a irregular curriculum. It's not until the almost catastrophes of the War of 1812, when the U.S. East Coast is constantly raided by Royal Navy raids and expeditions, assisted by Marines and other expeditionary forces. Washington is burnt down. All the federal buildings are burnt except one, the Customs Office. And there is significant panic along the East Coast and damage with costs that will last for years to repair. Coming out of that war in 1814, the Americans have decided that that cannot happen again. So what they do is plan to reform the military from 1816 to 1820. And one of the reformations is this college at West Point. In 1815, they send Winfield Scott and other officers over to Paris. Actually, before the Battle of Waterloo, the decision is made, but after the Battle of Waterloo, they arrive. And they spend quite a while culling French treaties and expertise to bring back to the US. And they begin the reformation of the West Point Military College from an ad hoc curriculum to a 4-year curriculum from selected officers selected by state officials, and would have to pass an entrance exam to get in. And it's mainly on mathematics and other scientific skills, not on liberal arts, not on knowledge of Greek or Latin, because the poor sons of America were never allowed to experience that education. But the Jeffersonian idea of merit was brought in. They said, okay, they'll base the entrance on a hard factual exam. And that's that's a map of West Point 1830. That's a picture. It's quite a beautiful place, fairly isolated, no trains in there until 1840, no roads even, just access by water. They brought this curriculum to West Point in 1820, and it was called military science. And if you look at all of the texts of the time, the word military science, as well as military art, but most often military science, is in the texts. And it's broken down generally into either 4 or 5 elements. Always engineering, sometimes qualified as field engineering. Later, in the 1830s, civil engineering is added. Always fortifications, both field and permanent. Always artillery, and always the science of movement. That they call it the science of strategy or the science of generals, and it's about a campaign, designing a campaign and maneuvering armies in a campaign theater of operations. Often, through the 1820s, you will hear the word logistics come into play as well. So I've added it to the military science. This is hard to see, but you don't need to see the detail. This is a 4-year curriculum. No other academy in the world is doing a 4-year curriculum. And it goes to a 5-year curriculum in the 1850s. And it's fairly inflexible in its design. The student starts at dawn, is a roll call, does a period of mathematics study in their rooms, breakfast, a recitation in mathematics, study, recitation, military drills for at least an hour, sometimes 2, supper, and study in the evening. Of the 4 years, there's only 3 courses in the first 2 years. Drawing, which is a minor course, but the main emphasis in 2 years is study and recitation of mathematics and French. That's it, nothing else. Tactics during that period. Why French? Because most of the literature in their growing library is in French. And the Americans at that period considered that the master lessons to be learned in war are from the French. So it was mandatory for 2 years for cadets to learn French and use the French text to study mathematics. In the 3rd year of study, they enter into chemistry, stone cutting, some field engineering and other engineering works that are looking at ordnance and some artillery stuff. And in their 5th year, they're looking at permanent fortifications and the science of war, this maneuver, this campaign design. So the course of 4 years. Monday to Friday the same, Saturday morning studies, Saturday afternoon, the library visit, you're allowed to get 1 book, not a novel, not allowed, and sports. Sunday church and study starts in the afternoon for 4 years. Very, very probably mind-numbing curriculum. So because of that, interpretation starting in 1950, look at this curriculum and make judgments on the West Point curriculum, its doctrine, and its influence on the Civil War. And starting with Samuel Huntington in 1957, he concludes that West Point was not only inefficient at producing an army officer, really only good at producing an engineer or artillerist, that it actually was an obstacle to creating professionalism in the US Army before the Civil War, because it did not teach strategy properly. His book, The Soldier and the State, was of course really well received, very powerful influence, including on the Civil War. And this theme of an unprofessional officer corps carries on until even today. It's picked up a decade and a half later by T. Harry Williams, who takes the next step and says, yeah, it's probably true they're unprofessional, but what we really know is those generals who were West Point graduates at the beginning of the Civil War were not knowledgeable enough to command forces of scale and to conduct maneuvers. And in fact, the best of them were great improvisers because they had an American frontier background and they could improvise, and that's how they were successful. That theme carries on. James Morrison writes books on West Point, and while he gives credit to a lot of the features of the curriculum, does say that that study in the last year on strategy was not really strategy. It was just theoretical. It was only 9 recitations, so 20 hours. They would forget that very, very quickly in their military career. That theme persists, even though I've challenged it in books. Matt Moten, 2000, does a study of the Delafield Commission 1854-55 and says, if you read that, you realize these officers know nothing about liberal arts. And because they're not trained in the liberal arts, they're not professionals. That they're lacking skills needed to command at high levels. Tries to make the case for that. Stephen Jones gets a step further and says that West Point had 0 influence on the entire Civil War. None at all. And Brian Holden Reed has done an anachronistic step saying, because of what Matt Moten has said and others, not teaching the operational art to officers makes them ignorant when they come to command at high level in war. And therefore they go back to being improvisers. None of them accredit any influence to West Point in the Civil War. J.D. Hilton does, and that's a book that's back from the 1950s as well, but his thesis is different. He says that all of the curriculum is strictly Geminian. It's from Germany. And therefore it's old, it's backward looking, it's not innovative and new. Well, my job is to disprove all of these people and convince you about it. Where are we going to start? We're going to start with, and don't mind the detail on the slides. It's really these are just background for the context, I'll tell you. The study period that they do every day, at least 3 times, most times 4 times a day, is either in a lecture hall, but most often in their room with a dedicated text, and normally only one text. Lithograph notes or a book from the library, and they have to memorize a portion of it before recitation. Now, modern educators really poo-poo the idea of memorization as being any value at all. But those of us who've had to suffer it know that that's not quite true. There's a lot of things that if you memorize, you can recite fairly well. But then if it's applied again, or again recited, it sticks. And it sticks the more times you apply it. And most of the study was dedicated to theorems and things like that, which were not only recited once, but repeated again and again and again for 4 years. So I don't believe that the idea of memorization is wrong. Recitation was very formal. They would leave their study periods and march to their section room, present themselves, and on the direction of a faculty, be directed to a blackboard to write out a theorem and be prepared to explain it, and then answer questions from the instructor. It must have been daunting and formal for young cadets, 16, 17 years old. But over the course of years, they handled it. On each recitation, and there were 3 recitations a day, they would be scored from 0 to perfect in their knowledge of what was presented. At the end of the day, the instructors had a total of their performance in the recitation. At the end of the week on Saturday afternoon, the academic board met and they calculated the weekly score from recitations of each cadet. And then they deducted merit points. Anyone breaching the academy rules was deducted points. They came off the total from the recitation, and that was their weekly score. And that was a grade for them to decide whether they're going to go up in a section or down in a section. Each class for each subject had 3 or 4 sections. The best, smartest at the top, the worst in the lowest section. The worst had to get through the curriculum in the year. The best were expected to get through the curriculum very quickly and get on to advanced studies. So you go up and down based on your weekly things. This was challenged a number of times in the antebellum period, but the answer always came back to the American idea of Jefferson. This is the only way we can have a merit system. And it actually, in terms of figuring out who were the real workers and who were the non-workers, it kind of worked that way. There were exceptions, but this is the idea of the recitation. And if you did something in recitation a number of times, it would be in your brain. It wasn't all classrooms. There was a period every day on tactics. And then every summer, the cadets moved from their barracks 200 yards to the plain and set up a camp. And they lived in a camp for 2 months. And they did nothing but soldier skills for 2 months, for 3 summers, until they graduated in the 4th year. The encampments looked at these things. Infantry skills. For the first year of their cadet, they had to master what every soldier in the U.S. Army lived and knew. And that was put together into platoons and companies during the encampments and eventually into battalions. Everything infantry, in terms of evolutions, formations, and firings, was taught to every single cadet and practiced every summer. Artillery. Field artillery and horse artillery in the 1830s, and coastal artillery. From the practice of the gun and the gun crew, all the skills, every cadet learned all the skills. Gun crew command, battery command, for all the various types, field, horse, and coastal. Every cadet learned every one of those jobs. In cavalry, they had the biggest cavalry riding building in the world at that time. And every cadet would learn how to be a cavalryman in several arms, how to command a troop, up to how to command a squadron, formations and evolutions and the like. Every cadet had to learn military science. As I said earlier, permanent field fortifications. The basis of their teaching, as you see from the diagram, is the Vauban bastion. Started as the Italian trace in the 16th century, proliferated throughout the world because of the empires. You can go anywhere in the world where I have a house in Annapolis, Royal Nova Scotia. There is a fort with Vauganian bastions and a glacis on it. Learning to do that in permanent fortifications and in field fortification required advanced mathematics skills. The cadets would learn that, every one of them would learn that, and every one of them would participate in building ramparts and bastions during their West Point experience. Every cadet learned not just how to fire cannon and command guns, but how to make them, the casting of cannon, how to make limbers, how to make wheels, how to make carriages, how to train artillery horses, how to apply the fire in various fortifications, field and permanent. Again, everything. Engineering, not just fortifications, but expedient bridging, roads, and eventually canals and railroads, and how to build the equipment to do that. How to build carts for logistics, various types, as well as obstacles in front of your fortification, and ferries to cross rivers. You don't need to read all of this, but the purpose of all this education, when it served at the U.S. Officer Corps, regardless of where it was across the continent, could create an efficient system of supply, could move and conduct the operations of armies, could provide quarters, hospitals, and transportation for the army, garrison equipage, could conduct surveys, could repair and build roads and bridges, could repair and build quarters, barracks, storehouses, stables, blockhouses, select and set up encampments, and conduct movements in the supply of the army. How to conduct sieges against permanent fortifications. Again, a Vauganian idea, perfected by Vauban, who created what he called the triumph of the method, which was published in the 1740s, where he guaranteed the fall of a fortification by conducting a siege with stages, encamping outside the field artillery range of the fort, zigzag trenches to create a parallel semicircle, which is the profile, that same profile as the fort, throwing out artillery batteries from the parallel to hit one side of the fort, zigzag second parallel batteries, zigzag third parallel batteries with mortars into a point, a concentrated point of fire and movement of the besiegers to a point where they can smash and create a breach in the fortification. That's the essence of siegecraft for about 250 years. But not only did they learn that, in their strategic movements lesson, science of strategic movements, they took this idea. Others had taken it before. Les Lumiere, French, German, British scholars of the mid-1700s took this idea and they translated it into campaigning. And they said, when we're maneuvering armies against each other, the best thing we can do is have a fortified frontier with fortifications and depots, just like we build a parallel at a siege, from which, instead of zigzag, we create lines of operations against a strategic point, one strategic point, which is it gives us advantage over the enemy. And the more lines you have, the broader this base of operations, like the broader the base of the parallel in the siege, and the more concentrated the lines, you create an angle of operation, which if you have a great one, it gives you maneuver space, an advantage over the enemy. This idea lasts for hundreds of years. In fact, I'll argue it lasts until the Gulf War of 1991. It's the essence of what's called the science of strategic movements. Jomini puts it into holograms, squares, rectangles. This one, the French base on the Rhine, the French base on the Main, and an allowance of the French army to outposition a Prussian army. That's taught in the West Point Academy. So the idea of outmaneuvering using these concepts is the essence of their strategy. It comes down to both strategic and tactical level, comes down to concentration of force. The sine qua non is concentrate as much of your force as possible against one point of the enemy that will give you a position of advantage, and you will probably win. That's taught throughout the West Point years. Throughout all the texts that you read, and I can read French and German as well, it's the same in all the languages. There is discussion about the role of genius and the role of the staff, or military science without the name of the staff. This comes from a dichotomy created in the 1600s by scholars, primarily Blaise Pascal, philosopher, scientist, who talks in his books about two minds: a mathematical mind that solves problems by science, scientific method or math, and an intuitive mind, which is more artistic and sublime, which solves problems from experience and self-discovery and other things. This dichotomy seems simplistic to us, but it's actually in the literature from the 1600s right through to the mid-late 1800s. It's in the West Point text. What is the role of genius vis-a-vis military science? And in the teaching there, they say genius is a fantastic thing to have, but you can't guarantee having a Napoleon or a Frederick the Great. And if you don't, you need to compensate by having military science and a staff, so that you have something that you can survive with. But if you want to take the geniuses, as Napoleon and Frederick, you're going to find out they are masters of military science as well. And therefore, the study of principles that they call science is fundamental for understanding how to command in war. This is kind of lost in the 20th century, but it's very clear when you're reading in the 19th century. So I challenge, based on that, I challenge this to somewhat, because I don't believe that these scholars, and I respect them and I've used their works, I don't think they appreciate what West Point was trying to produce: a generalist officer. They did not receive, the cadets did not receive assignment to a corps until their graduation date. So they could all be interchangeable to an extent on a battlefield. They were trying to produce a generalist who could be employed anywhere in the US on tasks, and in a battle, command artillery if they had to, or at least understand how their artillery under command should be used across all of the different services. This generalist idea was pretty unique in the world at the time. But it wasn't just they wanted generalists. The politicians and the people of America demanded it. The army, as of 1820, was reduced to 7,000 to 8,000. The officer corps, 600 to 700. And they were tasked with tasks that were somewhat incomprehensible to people outside of the continent. I mentioned about sea fortifications being announced as one of the priority things before the War of 1812. These are the fortifications on the East Coast at 1800. And the need and the demand just grew over time. 1812, there's internal fortifications now because of the Louisiana Purchase. They need to defend in the West. And they need to start building roads between these fortifications. I'm going to skip forward here a couple. This is 1821. They've extended the sea fortifications into the Gulf. They've taken on the responsibility to build roads between fortifications, but not just that, they're given another task. The government says, we need you to develop internal communications. And they call it internal improvements. So waterways internal to the coast, waterways along rivers, canals beside rivers, all this stuff collectively by the nation is called internal improvements. It's a great benefit to the people in the states, but it's under the responsibility of federal authority. And who has to do it? U.S. Army officers, graduates of West Point. Between 1820 and 1860, over 50% of the defense budget allocated to the military goes into sea fortifications, and internal improvements, not into the other bits and pieces of the military. So this creates a power structure. Hopefully you can follow my finger as we look at this. The field commanders here, which are Gaines and Scott, east and west, have absolutely no command over the evolving staff that is created in Washington. No responsibility for them whatsoever. Staff of adjutant general, judge advocate general, inspector general, paymaster, commissary, surgeon general, chief of ordnance, quartermaster general, chief topographical engineer, and chief engineer. Those are independent of the line command. They work directly for the Secretary of Defense, and they fight each other to get as much money out of Congress as they can. This is a very, very different system than Prussia. And many of the scholars I mentioned earlier are always comparing the US Army and the antebellum to what it should be, Prussia. And I keep saying it's impossible. That's not what the Americans wanted. They wanted a power structure that enabled internal improvements. The states did not trust standing armies, but they liked engineers working in their state. This is why you get this power nexus. So the money that's allocated to internal improvements and fortifications goes to the Fortifications Board and the Internal Improvements Board. They're chaired by the same person, the Chief of Engineers. And over the course of 40 years, there's 17 Secretary of Wars, but there's only 3 Chief Engineers. So get where the continuity is in the lobbying for money and when they get the money, the allocation. It is very powerful in understanding antebellum US Army. You need to understand this demand. And the demand goes from the people through Congress to the engineers and then down to West Point. They're the ones who have produced all these people who are going to do all this work. The superintendent of West Point who does the changes that are critical is Sylvanus Thayer, 1817 to 1833, an engineer, but all the rest until after the Civil War are engineers as well. And they're responsive to the chief engineer, not to the field commanders of the US Army. Now, at some point in the 1820s, a commanding general position opens up in Washington to ostensibly oversee the commander's east and western department. But at no point does this commanding general exert direct command over the bureaus. So you can see it's a very, very different structure, which makes you understand why West Point was the way it was for 40 years. Also, at West Point, there's a tremendous degree of continuity. This fella here is Dennis Hart Mahan, the father of Alfred Thayer Mahan. He's at West Point as a cadet from 1820 to 24. He goes to France to study engineering for 4 years, 24 to 28. Comes back as a military instructor for 4 years, retires and becomes a professor of engineering at West Point, 1832 to 1871, and head of the academic board. He's the most influential person to the cadets at West Point, and therefore the generals of the Civil War. Full stop. But also he's supported by the other heads of department, Bartlett, Church, Weir, Farrard, and Bailey, who are natural philosophy, mathematics, drawing, French, and chemistry heads of departments. They stayed for decades. They form the academic board. And of course, like every academic institution, they're conservative about change, which gives you an idea of why the continuity of engineering and artillery in the curriculum of all that time. The demand grows greater in the 1820s and 30s when they start to build canals, particularly in the Northeast. These are canals here. And then they start to build road infrastructure at the same time. So in the decades before the Civil War, a great amount of effort is made by the Army to develop this infrastructure. In 1840, you begin to see roads creeping up across the frontier, but then it explodes to the continent in the 1850s with the expansion west. And we now see the development of coastal fortifications on the East Coast as well. And then the building of infrastructure, forts, and garrisons across the entire continent requires surveying. So it falls upon, again, the regular Army, engineer officers, or seconded to the engineering corps to do the surveys of the entire West. And they start before the 1820s, but they really get moving in the 1830s and 40s and 50s. This is probably the best survey done in American history, done by he was not major at the time, he was a captain, he was a lieutenant actually when he began, Emory, and he's tasked to do the entire West just in advance of the American-Mexican War. It's one of the best series of maps they've ever produced. He does a memoir with it, a journal of his expedition, and there are literally hundreds of pages of scientific material, botany, mineralogy, sky readings, astrological readings, barometer readings, to the tune of 1,000 pages, which of course the scientific community in America loves, but also those who are developing states like, or with the aspiration of developing Western states. This is the kind of work of what we call the topologs, the topographical officers. And this is the work they had to do in the 50s. These topographical officers were really, really important in war. We'll see that most of all in the next scene. So this demand for officers led to all the best, or I say best, the highest scoring graduates would go to the engineers, the topographical engineers, and the ordnance corps as their permanent assignment. Because the demand was so great, the Army reached into all the infantry regiments, some of the artillery, static artillery regiments, and the cavalry regiments, and seconded good officers to the engineering department, to the quartermaster department, to the ordnance department, throughout the course of the antebellum era. So here's a snapshot of 1835. There are 603 officers in the Army, and there's 128 of them on staff duties with the bureaus from the infantry and artillery. This is a drain. A lot of those infantry companies are only one officer left. The others are off doing topographical work and such. So 36% of the officers of this 603 are doing non-infantry artillery work, cavalry. They're doing the scientific work that's required. And this statistic continues, goes down towards the Civil War from 63 in 1835, and 1860, it's still 22% of the officer force dedicated to that. So it's not just a matter of an education at West Point, it's the application of the skills throughout decades before the Civil War that's creating the skill in these officers. The real vindication of the system, though, comes in the Mexican War, which is there have been very good works tying the Mexican War to the Civil War. But I would say there's a lot more work to be done. The Mexican War showed the U.S. that their idea of strategic maneuver was correct, that bases of operations and lines of operations were correct. And the one that's most telling is in the Rio Grande frontier, the Americans burst in and they win, and their positioning threatens Mexico City down here. But they decided to do a second base of operation from Veracruz. And the two of these bases of operations actually paralyzes Santa Anna and his 30,000-man army, and they retreat into Mexico City, to be taken by Scott's 10,000 a few months later. And really, it's not just Scott's 10,000, it's engineers and it's artillerymen that are decisive in the Veracruz to Mexico City campaign. There are plenty of brave Mexican infantry officers and cavalry officers, but the Mexican army doesn't have really any. And their artillery skills are primitive compared to the Americans. They can't build the bridges that the American army is building as it marches deep into Mexico, or span the waterways, or build roads. So after the Civil War, or sorry, after the Mexican War, the idea of West Point is solid in the minds of Americans. Reinforced at the same time by this Mahan and others writing books for not just military officers, but militia officers. And there's a proliferation of military science books in the 1840s and 50s across America. They also, Mahan also starts a course at West Point. Officers who are serving in the military come back to West Point to teach the various skills, tactics, engineering, whatever. Mahan gets permission to set up a graduate studies course where those engineer artillery officers have to come to him bi-weekly have courses of study, write papers, and present their arguments to him over the course of 2 years. Now, seeing the papers, they're graduate level. Now, I'm not convinced these officers are not learning beyond West Point, because it's evident in the record. As well, oh yeah, you can't see this, but here are 37 officers who served under Mahan's graduate program between 1840 and 1860. And you've got major generals, brigadier generals of Union and Confederate armies in those lists. Almost everyone. Also, Mahan accepted invitation from the faculty and instructors at West Point to be the president of the Napoleon Club, which would meet every Wednesday night at West Point. Volunteer, the officers would come in, and under his tutelage, they would be directed to prepare for 6 weeks to present a campaign from Napoleon or Frederick the Great, and a paper. The papers vary from length 60 to 100 pages. Minimum of 12 sources required. I'm not sure that was met all the time. Here are the list of officers we know: George Thomas, George McCullum, James McPherson, Gustavus Smith, William Franklin, Joseph Reynolds, John Gibbon, Quincy Gilmore, Edmund Smith, John Foster, Cadmus Wilcox, Thomas Neal, Absalom Baird, George Cullum, Barton Alexander, and Henry Clark. We know they were in the Napoleonic Club. I've also researched the mess records of the officers' mess and the library records of who withdrew which books during all those years, and I've come up with another list of names of possibles that were in the Napoleonic Club. And there again, it's a litany of the Civil War generals. And they're passionate about their studies, it's a volunteer organization, and they're writing graduate level papers on military history. What are some of the names? Well, this is just a guesswork from the record. So Lee's on top with Jesse Reno, Reynolds, Hardy, Fields, McCook, Warren, Whiteson, Griffin, Ransom, Gilbert, Seymour, Walker, Webb, Rush, Hawes, Garnett, Sill, Cosby, Kelly and Beach, Errol, Stewart, Hunt, Van Buren, Elbert, Haynes, Williams, Burkin, Dubarry, Sackett, Lefevre, Doan, Perry, Jones, Gilson, Piper, Bernard, Morton, Alexander, Porter, Alexander, John Pegram, Herman, and Comstock. A good half of them are successful Civil War men, but we're not sure they were. All I can say is they took a lot of Napoleonic books out of the library during this period. In the 1850s, they send a delegation to Europe, to all the major powers of Europe and to Crimea to gather information and compare their own military and curriculum at West Point to the Europeans, called the Delafield Commission. And it comes back with very powerful documents, but also good innovations on the field fortifications used. The very, what we call First World War nature of the Crimean War in certain parts. They have positive notes too. McClellan comes back. He's one of the 3 that goes. And McClellan was at Veracruz. He was helping unload the ships at Veracruz and moving or building road, move artillery into the siege lines, which in a matter of 1 week destroyed the resolve of the defenders of Veracruz. McClellan compares that to what he learned about from interviews of British and French officers about the expedition to the Crimea and how disastrous was the loading of the ships and the mismanagement of the proper equipment at the wrong times, especially with artillery. And he's positive in his reporting about the role of American military science in getting that stuff right. At the eve of the Civil War, West Point had, since 1802, graduated 1,966 officers. 1,135 would go on in the Civil War. And of those officers, 850 of them had staff experience before the Civil War, of the type I just talked about: TOPOG, ordnance, field fortifications. Some of them at fairly high level. So the idea that the graduate West Point cadet going into command of the Civil War was ignorant of everything beyond company level tactics is proven wrong as far as I'm concerned. But we have to study the Civil War to know for sure. The Civil War, we see military science applied. These are fortifications in 1862 at Manassas, and this is a bastion. I could take Mahan's sketch, put it right here, and you'd see exactly the same thing. And it evolves to 1864 to 65 to detailed field fortifications at St. Petersburg. This bridge was built by Grant in 7 hours. It spans the James River, 700 yards long, and it completely surprised Lee's forces at Petersburg because it opened up a new base of operation. The logistics quartermaster work of the Civil War is incredible to read. It's of scales that you can only, when you read it, you go, well, this is bigger than anything I'm seeing in Europe at the time. The Quartermaster General Meigs was the largest employer of people in America. He had 100,000 people working in the quartermaster school. I'm not military, contract. And part of that was Herman Hull, who commanded the U.S. railway system of 10,000 employees, 6,000 rail cars, whole trains dedicated to repairing railways and building bridges. The Confederates could not match this because they didn't have the industry to actually do this. But the U.S. logistical system in the North by 64, 65 was incredible. And most of the key players are West Pointers applying what they learned from military science. The scales of supplies going into feeding the field armies of the North is actually placed down. The ordnance, they're producing over 1 million small arms a year, 1,500 cannon a year, over 1.5 million cannon shells, 200 million musket balls a year, Union Army in 63, 64, 65. Montgomery Meigs meets Sherman's 60,000 man army at Savannah after Sherman had marched across Georgia and gives them 60,000 new uniforms and pair of boots. He does it again a month and a half later at St. Bernard. This massive news. But also military science. I won't go into this in detail, it's too small. They're using fortified frontiers, bases of operations and lines of operations, both the East and West in every one of their campaigns. And look at the campaign studies in the official records, and the words base of operations, and lines of communication, and lines of operation come up all the time. The calculations are being done based on what they learned, not by improvisation. Right through to the very end, when you get Lee meeting Meade and Grant on the Rappahannock, and Grant changing his base of operations from here to here to here to here to here 4 times in 4 months. It's preventing Lee from cutting Meade's army off of a line of communications to a base. At the same time, Grant moves Sheridan down the Shenandoah and Sherman up the Carolinas, and eventually Lee has no more base of operations. He can come out of Richmond, but he has nowhere to go to connect with the base. And that's it. The end of the conflict. And who does all this work? Well, of the 1,135 graduates, 368 are generals. Commanding generals, field army commanders, corps, division, brigade, and then department commands, which are sometimes the same as those. And then there are 797 others who, between captain and colonel, are the key staff of all the armies and departments on both sides, with the exception of a small handful of successful appointed generals. So on this statistical analysis, as well as detailed curriculum analysis, I come to the conclusion that the U.S. Army at the beginning of the Civil War had a scientific way of war, which has absolutely fundamentally influenced the outcome, the conduct of the war, and the outcome of the war. Thank you very much.